Hi everybody, let's answer an age-old question. Why is it so difficult to build great user experiences, especially on the web? How has the evolution, and in some cases the devolution, of tools and IDEs, programming idioms, a lot of organizational structures and incentives, and even conventional wisdom, led us to a spot where it literally takes heroics to build something fun, to ship something great, performant, accessible, something that meets all the various criteria that we all have for what constitutes a really high quality user experience. So to dive into this, I'm thrilled to talk to Cheng Lou, someone who balances a very deep understanding of the visual world with a deep understanding of software engineering and computer science, and has spent a lot of his professional career and his personal time looking into how can we make it easy for developers to build great user experiences. How can we make building great user experiences the default and not something someone needs to actively keep thinking about in the forefront in order to make sure something is delivered? So to touch upon all these topics, we're going to start at the very beginning, which is like that for many of us, how Flash was the starting point for our careers in design and development and the melding of it, and then how it all goes from there. So it's going to be a fun conversation. So sit back, let's get started. All right, Cheng, great to meet you. And for the audience, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Kirupa. I'm Cheng. I used to work at Facebook on various projects. I used to work on React.js, a little bit on Messenger, and then ReasonML, Rescript. And right now I'm at Apple. I started my career doing Flash, which is how I actually met Kirupa back then, all the way back when I was a teenager, pretending to be an adult on the Kirupa forum. That was a great time, very formative. And here we are today. It's a pretty incredible journey so far.
Yeah, one of the things I've seen you've been working on is a lot of front-end like activities. Have you always just gravitated towards the front end in general, or is it just something that you accidentally stumbled upon?
So I think I first started by drawing stuff when I was 6, right? That's how I developed some liking for the visual stuff, right? At Facebook I was a full stack person, but yes, I do seem to always gravitate toward the front end. I wouldn't say that's necessarily the influence of just drawing sketches or anything like that. The real influence was when my family and I immigrated to Canada, and we brought a laptop. It was like a French-speaking place, and I had no friends whatsoever, so I was just on my laptop. I think that's a slightly stereotypical story, but it is what it is. And I was playing games, and at one point that passion kind of turned into, this game is not doing this right. Like, what if I make my little thing, right? And so there was a Flash, right? So basically I was just, I think I started with either Flash 5 or 6, 6 being Flash MX, right? For the OG people. And then that was fun because you get to draw, and then the scripting comes afterward. I mean, it's not the cleanest architecture or anything like that, but, for a tiny to medium sized thing, especially as a kid, that was good enough, right? And that kind of just flashes on the web, right? Sure, you can compile to a executable, but I think nobody did that. Everybody just put it in an embed on the web, and there are many great portals on the web back then for showing Flash works, and Newground being one of them. And there are a few Chinese ones I used to frequent when I didn't speak English or French. And actually the extension of that when Flash kind of died is, you keep doing things on the web. And yeah, I did dabble a little bit in native too and all that. But ultimately, I would say throughout all these years, one of the things I've noticed is that the people who do graphics and who end up doing front end think very differently than people who start with HTML and hypertext and do front end. They do have some very different perspective on how they execute certain things. So I will consider myself more from the graphic part that happen to do the hypertext part, I would say.
I mean, the funny thing is that's something that I've also noticed from many people I meet as well. And I don't have a good theory as to why that is, but one, poorly formed opinion that I strongly hold, is that because Flash was a great onboarding tool where that building a great application or a great animation or anything interactive required a visual component and a logic and programming component. But because the visual component was familiar and was front and center available, it made it easy for people like you who enjoyed doing drawings and had more of a visual, mind for some of these things to be able to translate that into getting started by translating an idea and putting visuals on it. It certainly was the case with me. My interest was always around drawing and doodling and scribbling. Programming was never a part of it. And even when I was using Flash, I used it a lot for the animation capabilities. The programming part was a necessity. It was a necessary evil I need to learn to get my visual part of it done. But I always approached it from a visual first point of view. Is that how do I translate this idea I have in my mind, which is very visual, into something that can be represented? I think that approach, opens the door for a lot more people where I am almost certain that if there was no Flash and I had to learn HTML from the very beginning as part of translating my ideas, I would never have done the things that I'm doing because it would have never logically connected. Like my awareness of HTML being a thing that would eventually allow me to translate something visually on screen, and the massive hurdles involved in going from raw text in HTML to that would have meant that I would have given up a long time ago. I'd probably be doing more visual work in like Photoshop or After Effects or so on, but never in a tool that ultimately allowed you to create something that goes on the screen.
So I do have, this is something I think about too. And I think a lot of it, yes, it is absolutely the education that Flash gave. And I'll tell you something unrelated to Flash. And this is not to start a platform war or anything like that. This is just, take it as it is, right? I have my own opinion of these matters. But this is just pure observation data for you. Back when I was on Messenger, I was mostly on the web part, but we sat next to the native teams, Android, iOS, and the backend folks who sometimes did their toe into the code bases and all that. And that was, I was immersed in that environment for around 4 years at least. And you see people who freshly graduated go through pipeline in parallel, and you observe how they evolve, and you see batches and batches of these people switch job and coming back and all that. And they definitely, the people on the native side, for example, iOS, they definitely do end up talking about different things than the people on the web. That is absolutely true. It's sad how almost like there's no overlap between the topic when they ship a product. And this is reproduced across the 5 years I've been at Facebook. I've observed these teams doing the exact same product, shipping on different platforms with the same screen fact, like on the iPad, for example. But anyway, I'm going to stop here. But yeah, they do talk about lots of different topics, and I think thinking back on Flash, this is absolutely the case. One thing I remember when I was doing Flash was there was this programmer who was a friend of my parents, and then he's like, "Oh yeah, you do programming too. Now it's nice to start young and learn about these things. What language do you use, like C++ or anything?" I was like, "No, I use this action script thing, right?" And he just told me about like C++ and printing hello world, right? And something that stuck with me throughout all these years is I kept asking him, like, where are you showing that hello world? And he said, well, you print it and then it goes into terminal. And I was like, but like, where's the box around it, right? Is it that C++ is so opinionated it will put up an alert and draw the thing, and like there's a button and then you can click on it, like you didn't even specify any handlers, right? So I couldn't understand that mentality at all. But ultimately, when you truly start doing programming, obviously that clicks, and the mentality is very different. And on the other side too, like starting with pixels as a primitive definitely builds a different mental model that you use versus starting with on the web, let's say rectangles, I would say.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear your take on why that might be the case. One take that I always have is that, let's say our human brain has a certain amount of capacity for being able to process what the present is like in the future and so on. When our present is really bogged down in terms of like technical details of like, okay, here's the console, I'm writing at the base level. Now later add a layer of abstraction myself to go one level higher and so on. By the time we get to the point where I can now draw a circle with some text on screen in like a language like C or C++, and let's say I didn't know much about a great graphics library, so I had to learn the hard way how to do all of this. the amount of fatigue and effort out of energy out of spent getting to that point would have gotten me to my, okay, I'm done. This is great. I'm gonna take a break now and then come back to it later. Whereas in Flash, you kind of jump many layers of abstraction. The point where I'm like, oh yeah, by default, here's a pixel, here's something I'm drawing on screen. You still have a lot more mental capacity and energy to go deeper and go like, oh, can I make this move? Can I make this spin? How do I add sound? What if I want to share this with my friend very quickly and just, create like this thing where, the cursors from multiple people on the screen moving at the same time? It's almost like the opportunities and possibilities were just more open to us because, at least in my case, my naiveness in what isn't possible was completely redefined by what Flash made available, obviously, because I didn't learn C++ or Visual Basic or anything before the Flash was my first experience of visual programming, essentially. So I had no concept of the complications and things that others had to go through. So I just took things for granted. And that I guess, arrogance helped me in some ways when I think about what I'm doing now.
So I thought about this a lot, actually. And there are, like, as always, it's like a multi-dimensional kind of thing. But like here are the few things I can think of that allow you to have visibility over the full stack and all that. First is Flash. It wasn't general purpose, right? Like, you usually ship, and it has a graphical component to it. You ship these interactive experiences. It's not for like a microcontrollers or like a scaling servers. That's one thing. So suddenly the scope is narrower. So within that narrow scope, you get way more assumption you can work with, and you get to make a way more polished tool. Because if you're a backend developer and hypothetically there's an action script for backend, like what is the stage there even for, right? Like it takes like 80% of your screen and like you drag and drop. What are you drag and dropping? And like the impedance mismatch is pretty huge there, but it's very low when 90% of the time you have to work with the drag and drop objects. So that's one thing. The other thing is it was like a vertically integrated experience, right? So there was no scene that is considered as the glue between two projects. Oh, hey, this person owned this open source component, I own mine, and then there's a glue. And ultimately, as programming scales up, as like as the dimensionality scales up, I think who was it that said that? Richard Hamming or something? Like it's actually mostly glue. So it's crazy, but like the core component don't matter. You start working with the glue, and it's about the topology of that glue, and people go wild with all sorts of patterns that historically don't work out. But anyway, that glue disappear when you're in a vertically integrated stack, right? Because they just talk to each other because they're supposed to talk to each other. That's one. That's another thing, and also one extremely important part. Well, also the third thing is it was well executed. Yeah. And the fourth thing is an extremely important part is that they are very good at controlling the entropy of what they're doing. They are very good at controlling the complexity. And I do believe this is a trait of graphics people too, because they're pushing the boundaries. So it kind of pushes back against you. So over time, you do that for 5 years and you learn how to force the entropy down. Whereas I wouldn't say that currently on the web we're thinking much about any of these things. Like you think of a tiny thing and someone will blow it up into like a gigantic 10,000 line thing. And then the thing is, you have people don't seem to realize you have an absolute amount of budget for these kind of holistic thinking, right? If you have 10,000 line, you need to start thinking about resource allocation. But if you don't think about resource allocation and you're making your own little component on the side and think that open source solves everything, well, I love it, right? And my career took off thanks to that. But like, if you think that solves everything and you already blowed up to 10,000 lines, then suddenly that little piece becomes a black box, right? And now with the black box, guess what? You need glue, right? You don't get to vertically integrate nearly as well, right? So with Flash, like the amount of line of code I had to write to achieve the effect versus if I just roll my own thing, is the difference is stark, right? And to be clear, there's a lot of more code behind the scene that does the work, but the ability to traverse the stack, right, like you said, from very low to very high, and it can output stuff at the low level too, like, and also at the near the end of its life, had like some pretty cool 3D acceleration, right? Yeah. but the ability to traverse all the stack to like drawing the thing and then like actually making a component that's shareable. Nobody really did that, but you could share components too. But the ability to traverse that heavily relies on the fact that they shrink the amount of code. They shrink the amount of thing. Like, good enough here. Let's not double down on this because now the code size will explode 5x. Okay, let's do the next piece and the next piece. So if it all fits within 100,000 lines of code, let's say, for a professional, you can still fit that within a brain. If not, you still have to you will still have to eject pieces, and you won't have a holistic vision anymore.
No, what you would describe essentially sums up like almost decades of extremes in IDE and framework and language development. When we talk about vertical integration is a great example of it. With vertical integration, if done well, you get simplicity, you get ease of use, but you don't get the flexibility. You can't do all the things you might want to do. Like, it was a long time if you wanted to use Flash on the back end, for example, as like a headless app, there really wasn't the concept of that, whereas with something like C++, where I'm starting from the ground up, I can go in any plus directions and pay the complexity cost as a result of it. And same with the lines of code as well. In many ways, like you mentioned, a lot of these things, what we typically call like base class libraries or core language frameworks, they're just built into the Flash runtime. So even though you're writing like 2 lines of code to make something animate from one side to another, probably a million lines of code were already pre-compiled onto the runtime itself that you do not have to see or worry about, which in a world where abstraction was not provided for various reasons, then you would have to provide all those millions of lines yourself. And the typical tendency of developers and people like to tinker with things is that, oh, let me make a minor change here. Let me fork it. Now let me create my own dependency. And then you create fragmentation, which has its pros and cons. But if your goal is to have a simplified experience, you probably want to reduce as much of that. And what other point that you brought up that resonated is what Flash gave you was an opinionated, friction-free onboarding. You didn't have much choice. You could either choose between ActionScript 3 or ActionScript 2, and you had some very superficial changes around like frame rate and form factor, but those you could all change after the fact as well. So it just happened to have these things, but the idea was that you only have really one major entry point and then a few very minor levers you could pull to change your overall experience, and that was it. You were very narrowly constrained. And we could kind of see that playing out when Flash then evolved into Flex, where you now had the ability to see both the actual markup that generated the visuals itself. Because we knew there was markup being generated, but Flash hid that away. The MXML, you never could see in the Flash world. Maybe you could later, but you never could see it for like typical things. And when Flex came out, you actually had all of those exposed. You could actually see the build system. You could see the scripts that were running behind the scenes to compile all your various ActionScript files into the final output. You could actually see the markup that was being generated. And with that, we saw a lot of developers kind of who used to be traditionally in the Flash world kind of fall away by the wayside, because for them, the magic and the simplicity that Flash provided wasn't there. Because the big one was really the part we talked about, like the affordances. There's a common statement when it comes to development tools, which is like, you want to solve the problem in the domain you're in. So a visual task is best solved visually. So if you're drawing a rectangle, if you're drawing a circle, you want to use tools that allow you to draw a circle in a visual format. You don't want to take a visual item like a shape and then be writing like 20 lines of XML like syntax to get that going. You can, and that's what people do today in the HTML world, but that's not how our brains have really been wired and optimized for many years. And so everything you touched upon here like really goes into detail on like the extremes and the choices that Flash made that made it successful and ultimately not successful as well.
But that part actually annoyed me a lot, the SVG thing. Like, I actually, it's nice to know that how it works under the hood. It's good knowledge, right? And I always think like we should actually be able to understand at least one good level below us and one level higher. But like people tweaking SVG by hand is just like you don't tweak a painting on a pixel per pixel or brush by brush basis, right? Unless you're doing some statement about generative art and all that. But like people actually do that as a manual compression kind of a strategy, or like this path goes there and it's just all XML, and it just blows my mind actually, because we're not talking about like SVG is not full programming language, right, so to speak, and so like it's actually, this is the perfect thing where you just slap a tool and you drag it, drag the stroke themselves, immediate direct manipulation, right? And the fact that people do it with code, it's how many kids are lost in that? I'll tell you, you will have lost me a long time ago if this was the way to draw, and it doesn't scale, right? It scales to 1 icon and then 10 icon, and in order to scale to 20 icon, you start clamping down on like the restrictions, right? They all have to be this size. They all have to be using all these line maximum. And you force an uniformity upon them because that's the only way you can scale when you use that mental model and way of manipulating things. Whereas you're not going to make a single scene in Flash if you try to do that with SVG. Now, am I saying you will, like, everybody should be making these scenes in Flash on the website? No, but like if nobody, you didn't even provide them a ramp to go into that world, realize that there's an entire world out there, and then come back and then apply these techniques, the graphics technique, to your web page and make it better. And there's a rich world out there. Thankfully, though, this tradition has been inherited by the game people, because they have no choice. Besides text adventures and like idle games or whatever, it has to be visual. It has to be interactive. Right. Think about the usual optimization that we reach for the web. Like, people talk about this. They talk about this for the past 5 to 10 years, like something like static extraction of little snippets of whatever. Right. But it's like in a game, there's not even anything to extract almost. Well, there is some structure that are static, but like if your character moves and stays still, for example, right? It still has some micro movements, and the leaves still blow in the wind a little bit, right? So you don't get to say, okay, let's make this completely static so that I can like extract some snippet into like this kind of declarative format. And but then like by then you're making something else in the game, right? Like so you end up making a web page, and so right now our experiences are extremely static. And if you go on Hacker News or these kind of sites where people are extremely used to these kind of static experiences, like the concept of transition, like the way they talk about transition, like it feels like it's still a bunch of teenagers talking about transition, if I can say that, like in a not so nice way. Like, and they're like, oh well, the web page moves around, like, and that's disturbing. And it's like, well, it's disturbing if it's done wrong, right? Because nobody's doing it well anymore, and it wasn't that hard to do it well either, right? I'm not talking about whether you scroll, like I'm gonna fly some text over you or anything like that. That's like the scarecrow argument they're constructing, right? Like but we lost the capability of doing tasteful transitions because nobody was learning to make transition in the first place and make the mistakes and come back and properly make that work anymore. Anyway, I don't want to go on a tangent too much, but yeah, it's just topics that are always on my mind that I can't get rid of.
I mean, our entire talks here are designed to be entirely on tangent. So actually, I really want to go deeper into this because our world around us is not static. It's fluid. There's movement. There's a certain speed to things, and a lot of things have been written over the years. I think Disney did a really good job characterizing like the 12 principles of motion to kind of provide a pattern to how we can represent movement in a very realistic way. And game development, I do think, is probably one of the last frontiers today in many ways, where you kind of mix the world of procedural, programmatic kind of visuals and static visuals, and you have interactivity and also a lot of openness that kind of gives that little bit of magic as part of what you're building. You really are building worlds in this case, as opposed to just purely I'm building a spreadsheet, or I'm building a cell in a table or a document, and so on.
And the requirements are so high that you don't get room to like to do like obviously unrelated weird stuff. Like a game needs to push the pixels, right? You have to like vertically integrate many pieces. It's not the best thing, but it does help you teach you traversing the entire stack. And like game engineer, you often see game engineers who understand all the way from assembly to language making to GPUs and then to graphic, to making game editors, to the game experience itself, right? And to the artistic aspect. Like, how many people exist like that in web development? I would say very few compared to game developers, right? They traverse the entire stack because they had to compress this because the game demands that kind of things, right? Well, it's less and less true, but still, the people who are pushing the boundary, there are still generalists who can traverse the entire thing, which might end in 10 years maybe, but as long as you we'll see about that. Yeah.
But I think, which also goes to the challenge of there's a lot more web developers out there because you can kind of get away with being, specializing in one particular area and making a career and building projects out of it. Whereas a great game developer, it's very, very difficult to find. And many games, even simple ones, they have a team of developers. They have like 5, 6, 7, dozens who specialize in each of these areas that are so deep that their entire mental capacity is occupied by that one particular task and then duplicated across other layers of the stack that others provide to contribute to create some of these high quality games. And that's the other thing about Flash I always found very interesting. It was easy enough and it did just enough damage to how quickly you can get something out that a team of one person can actually handle the full end-to-end of things and then rely on like sound resources. Like FlashKit had the really popular sound library back then. So yeah, I needed sound. You just go there, get their royalty-free sound. You're good to go. There were all these font libraries that you get your fonts from. So you had the ability to scale it as well. Like one person with minimal knowledge or, maybe some hours of effort can go from having no idea how to create something to being able to create something that is semi-interesting. Might not be high quality, but at least it gets you closer than any other tool out there where after a few hours of tinkering, you know exactly what needs to be done.
Yeah. Hopefully Unity fills that role nowadays, but I think Unity is quite big now, and the starting template feels very different than like Flash. You're not drawing a stroke or anything like that. And also, one real constraint is Flash being 2D at the beginning. At least it helped a lot, right? Because if you directly go into 3D, I think you will have lots of people, because now we're talking about modeling and polygons, and then you're dragging, let's say, Maya. Like obviously, I don't think many kids start with Maya or 3ds Max. But yeah, if you look at the, for example, I made a gallery recently, right? It's just mostly like a symbolic kind of thing.
Yeah.
I would dare say that the transition in that gallery are not disruptive, right? They're not there to wave in your face. Look at me, I can do this, right? Like I can put a transition there because it wasn't done like that, right? It was mostly hopefully tasteful, and thinking in terms of just pages will have killed transition completely. And yes, I've seen like these kind of like people ask me about like my opinion on like this kind of transition APIs, right? That magically transform between one page and another. Like it works for the web, like 80% of the time it's good enough, right? But it doesn't give you any mentality for working with a transition. It's always feel like, whenever these API come out, it feels like transition is like, okay, fine, we'll have a transition, that kind of mentality. It's not like, okay, how do we design an experience like some people used to say, some kind of storytelling mechanism, right? The image is there and it is zoomed there because it has a purpose. Let's say it's an overly romantic way of saying about this, but ultimately the effect that I give is, I think, pretty apparent. And that gallery, that was also like a proof that it can be done without any dependency, right? Not yet. Obviously, one day you're going to reach for something, but not for like something like that. Like it's a grid. Come on, right? And that was without the data, that was like 400 lines of code. I actually asked people to estimate how many lines of code it is. I asked various developers from various framework communities and all that. And like their estimate blew my mind. Like they think like it's a 2,000 line plus dependency, 3,000. Someone said 10,000 lines. If you said 10,000 lines, then I think there's a very huge discrepancy between your mental model and what the mental model should be, right? And your entire architecture, when you code an ordinary web app in your company, your entire mentality is different, right? If it's 10,000 line, then the architecture you choose, the code you choose, the dependency you drag in, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of the kind of app you build, right? It's kind of like a Conway's law for a single person, for a single person's brain, right? Speaking of which, allow me to go on another tangent. I remember Mr. Colin Mock, who was very generous with me. Like back then, I was a kid pretending to be an adult using my dad's email, and I didn't know what I was doing. I was just sending him emails, asking questions about the book he wrote, which is like Action Script for Flash MX, the definitive guide. Right?
Yep.
That was so cool. And like I didn't know O'Reilly back then, and there's this like eel that twirled around, like it was green and it was nice, professional. But but no, he was very generous, and he replied back lots of my email, and that also has been very formative in my career. I just wanted to give a shout out to him, to let him know that, there's this kid with broken English that actually, did something. And it was a lot, in large part thanks to his generosity. So that aside, like, he also wrote a book called Essential Action Script 2.0, and then Essential Action Script 3.0. The thing is, and those are good books, that they're like good manual, good tutorials and all that. But for me personally, when I transitioned to ActionScript 2.0 to 3.0, right? I used all these patterns like MVC observables, like react to this and that. Like that was like 15 years ago, and it just there's Flash makes you realize that you're not getting work done. Like pure code doesn't make you realize that. It's that much of an impact, because Flash is your ultimate integration and unit test. Because you look at the effect, right? At the end, the screen is always open. You build and the screen is open. And even as a kid, you iterate and it's just like, hey, nothing is happening. What's going on? Okay, I don't understand MVC. Let me go back and like re-architect this code. And then you make another effect. And no, it's just that nothing was happening in my brain. Like I just used to attach a script onto a button and it worked, right? And I'm not saying that's the best architecture, but it scaled surprisingly well. And whereas MVC, I think, and all these kind of things that's happening on the web, the problem is not that they cannot scale up. I actually think that in some dimension they can scale up. The big problem is that they cannot scale down, right? Because the activation energy needed to make one pixel work, one triangle, one button, is huge, right? And when it's not huge, it's usually because they crafted a golden path, especially for that case and all that. But anyway, that was my impression of things. And speaking of ActionScript 2 and 2.2.3, like this is truly like a history repeating itself, right? Like sometimes we say that, but it's not true, because it's not really similar what comes before and after. But for ActionScript 2, I had to remind people, right? It's literally based on ECMAScript. It's the same spec as JavaScript. They run the same way and they look the same way. So I'm not making a superficial comparison. And what happened with ActionScript 3? Well, they decided, hey, we're going to add a real class system and throw away the prototype-based inheritance. That sounds familiar, right? And we're going to add a static type system because we can optimize some code like that. And we're going to have a brand new VM. It's going to be fast. And this is literally TypeScript plus Chrome's JIT plus like whatever is happening nowadays. And it's just, it truly is history repeating itself without a stage anymore. But,
yeah, it also just shows that we've been doing this for such a long time that we actually got to see this. You know, people often say that you've been living in a city for too long when a stadium gets built and it gets torn down while you're still living there. I think we're seeing the equivalent of that in the programming world, where we were there at the beginning when we saw the shift from 2 to 3 and how the gaps in the language and the syntax made it difficult to create high quality applications. So more guardrails and more formalities, I guess, were added. And then we're seeing the exact same thing, like you mentioned right now, with how JavaScript has evolved. It just took almost 20 years to get to where we are right now, which I guess is the same as the Betamax, VHS, Blu-ray, all these kind of comparisons, where it takes time for people to realize why we're doing some of the things that we are doing. But the fast feedback loop that Flash provided was something that was really magical in many ways. It was like you had the equivalent of the convenience of console.log that you get on the web today, but the output is not text. It's not just something in the console. It's actually in the context of your finished application, the actual movie frame that will be displaying your animation and the final creation. And agreed, I think when you always do it from that mindset, whether it is, we often talk about MVPs and making sure we ship products quickly and iterate based on real life feedback and so on. Flash made that more apparent in the development lifecycle world, where you almost never spent like more than a few minutes writing something before you hit Control and Enter and just make sure it worked properly in the Flash player before you went along and did something else, which is very different today, because right now you're probably in a tunnel visioned into one particular problem for like maybe multiple days on end. And by the time you step back and look at it, you're like, okay, this looks good. Or worst case, I invested way too much time in getting to the state. I'm going to sacrifice quality or performance or something like that. And that multiplied by 10, 100,000 times ends up getting us, in my opinion, to the state of the web today, which is the most average web page is about 1.4 megabytes or so. Some popular chat applications like 32 megabytes. And I'm like, what is going on? They require 32 megabytes of dependencies and so on for essentially displaying an input field and a collection of text fetched from a database somewhere in a remote server.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And some people they would defend that blow by saying, well, first, picture and video it will take even more bandwidth, which is true. But we're not comparing the same bits. Like 32 megabyte of code says something about your code base, right? Maybe a video is way bigger than that, but that's not the same, right? We can't compare it like that. That's one thing. It's an indicator of chaos and entropy in your code base. And then the second argument they will use is, along the same argument, they will say our computers have much more memory now. It's true, but again, like humans don't. Humans haven't changed very much, right? 1 MB worth of code that I can handle, 32 MB I cannot, right? And second thing is they say there's way more features now. There are some newer features, but if you look at like some of the state of the art in the past, even on iOS development and all that, like they actually surpass you in terms of features and in terms of polish, in terms of the holistic experience, within a very small form factor than whatever you bring on. And yes, there are more features, but honestly, after having done this for a while, I keep questioning myself: is this super linear? Is it really like that? But my conclusion is, at least in the scope of the web, no, it's not. Like you add one feature and it shouldn't justify like 10 megabytes more. Like it shouldn't be super linear like that, right? Like 10 features should not. Yeah, should anyway. And also, there aren't that many more features, so to speak. Honestly, like if you check the MSN days, right? MSN has more features than 95% of chat apps out there, right? And it wasn't the prettiest thing because the design language back then was immature, right? Like it was gratuitous abuse of gradients here and there. But in terms of feature set, if you really think about what MSN did, like the emojis, the pictures, the videos, and the text, and the real-time status updates, and all that, and all sorts of random, like corporate kind of widgets that they cram into that. That is still smaller than the random corporate stuff that they would cram into a normal, typical chat app, right? And so yeah, I think I don't know. It just even MSN itself, like it makes me feel like chat app now. And I wasn't saying IRC. I'm not asking you to go to the terminal and like cheat by saying, oh, I don't have to build an interface, therefore it's an order of magnitude less code because I literally don't draw anything. No, right? MSN was a full-blown native app with all sorts of weird Windows decisions there too, right? The programmer were great, but like they're also not the extreme great end of programmer or anything like that. So because people usually say, well, if you're an expert programmer, of course you can do that. But no, MSN was, it was an app, right? It was not like the cutting edge or anything like that. So I feel like we can make a very safe comparison that there is real bloat going on here, right? It's not it's not very justifiable. And yeah, I mean, we can talk about this a long time, but ultimately it just, I don't know what to do.
It's about incentives as well. Having been at Microsoft when the MSN app was rewritten and having seen some of the conversations around how to migrate from a legacy tech stack that was performant and it worked to what was then the managed code world where everything had to be rewritten in .NET and Windows Presentation Foundation and so on, which brought with it a lot of developer benefits. But no one would ever say that it was faster than a thing that it replaced. And with so many layers of abstraction removed where I'm calling an API, but that API brings in like 80 megabytes of working set memory and things like that. And as a developer on these kind of products, you have to realize like, okay, how much bandwidth and political capital do I have to go against the grain on some of these things? We're just going to resign myself to the fact that, okay, I can control these things with limited amount of turbulence. And these things, I'm going to resign myself to the fact that how it is going to be done is the way it's going to be done. Because I'm almost certain that if you talk to any developer who worked on any app that ends up becoming like, 32 megabytes of JavaScript or extremely slow and sluggish performance and so on, they'll all be the first one to say like, no, I care about code quality. I care about very compact, minimal things. I care about user experience and so on. But it's the typical death by 1,000 paper cuts, and sometimes it's actually a gigantic, chainsaw. It's going to be things where you just can't control it, and you're just going to have to resign yourself to the fact that yes, I want to do a great thing, but my hands are tied because of organizational dynamics, just technical headwinds, and other complications that the user is not the primary motive for we're doing things. There are other complications at play.
And the thing is, like that Conway's law actually applies bidirectionally for an organization. And one argument that people will reach is, hey, look, if it's a good dependency and all that, why does it matter, right? And for an MVP, that does not matter. But the thing is, right, because some people might say like in that 32 megabytes of MB of stuff, like a good 25% are dependencies. That doesn't actually help. As a matter of fact, when I try to code and I try to stay honest with myself and like count the transitive dependencies in the line of code, yeah, because it's not true that you can eject that into somewhere else. And then not worry about it. As a first naive approximation, if your function is very complicated and it's 100 line, you can wrap it yourself into a single function call, eject, literally put that code into node module if you want, or like a monorepo kind of style, whatever thing, right? And you will say, oh, it's one single line of code. Why do I need to count the extra 100 line of code? But no, that should not work like that, right? At least your first layer of dependencies, not a transitive one, should absolutely count toward you. When they don't, you end up creating these artificial boundaries. And the thing that people never talk about is that you might accidentally slice your entire mental model, or worse, your team structure, or worse, your inter-team, intra-team organizational structure across these boundaries. Because the moment I eject a dependency, this becomes something that can be maintained, at least superficially, like in parallel by someone else. But I don't know if that's the right boundary to divide my code. I just know I wrapped it because I don't want to see it too often, right? And so that cross-cutting really ends up, like I said, a reverse Conway's law. It ends up dictating, the most famous example would be something like microservices and all that. But it's true for MVC too. At one point, you end up with people thinking that, I can maintain this independently of that part of the view and all that, but it's just never true. And at least it's not true if you want to do a great job at it. One thing I think we don't teach in computer science schools, or in the industry, really. One thing I don't think we teach in school or in the industry in computer science is, well, we do teach how you should modularize code, right? How you should encapsulate code and split things apart so that they are easier to iterate on. But we never teach someone to centralize code, to properly recognize that this is a problem that is centralized by nature and that you're not supposed to try to divide this into smaller pieces. Because if you do, you're going to succeed and it's going to be even worse because the centralization nature still exists, but you just pretend you don't see it anymore, right? I see people like divide these code into two pieces, and ultimately they're like, well, you can work on only this file, but then what the truth is, and people know that it's the truth, that you just end up jumping between file and file, and oops, at that point, like this part ends up being used by another call sign, and it calcifies forever because you can no longer change it.
Yeah, it's a big tension between what is academically the right thing to do versus practical knowledge. I do find that every discipline, when you talk to someone, they always talk about the same thing. It's like what they learn formally and what is being done in the real world often don't fully match up. Maybe because I'm just so close to the space working with computers and also having gotten a computer science degree, I find that the feedback loops never quite get closed in computer science. I still feel like today, even now, people are being taught patterns and ways of doing things that are completely decoupled from reality, especially when you start thinking about how do you scale an app beyond just a particular class project or something that's just being work done by me and my college roommate or something, to a group of teams, distributed time zones, different languages, and all these things. How do you maintain coding standards and proper ways of engineering practices that just cannot work if you apply an academic lens to it. There's sometimes you just have to be in a situation where suboptimal solutions are the right thing to do for the long run.
Well, it's like the greedy algorithm, right? So sometimes it does work out and people refuse to acknowledge it, but the greedy algorithm absolutely is provably one of the best way to do things in many cases, right? Especially when you're confronting like unknown information in the future and all that, right? Academia work a little bit differently, and like the end goal is a bit different. Like I remember, to be fair, this is true in the current industry as well. Like, but they will make an app, and somehow the entire tutorial or the entire class, there was not a single screenshot of what the app looks like, right? Steve Jobs famously said, you got to go from the product back to the technology, right? I've been in the React community, and it's a little bit worrisome for me to see that all these new tutorials on Medium or on their blog or whatever, they can show an entire coding pattern, right? They can show an entire coding pattern and not show a single screenshot. Like there's no discussion of whether the button should be placed here and there. For them, it's almost like a different discipline, and that there's like a real cut there, and it's pretty uncomfortable to see actually, because you started getting misalignment of.
Agreed, because the end result is you're building for other people, you're building for human beings, and humans are visual creatures. If your final output is going to be something visual, I would expect the first thing to be emphasized greatly would be the final user experience. What is the initial state look like? What are the transitions when you hover over something? When you navigate from, what are the error states? Things like that. I think more formal applications tend to do a pretty good job with this kind of stuff, but most people as you're learning, that's the point when they need to be introduced to best practices, not much later on. Because once you learn things the wrong way, it's very, very hard to retrain and unlearn something unless you have a strong motive for it, which, as we've seen, the motives are never strong enough. No matter how many incentives you throw to people to do the right thing. We can see that with Chrome and their core web vitals and trying to index search pages give them higher ranks based on performance and so on. That, I think, is one step in the right direction, but we need to go even more fundamentally. It's part of you building it. If your mental model is, I'm going to just do an NPM package install that's going to add like 200 megabytes, and of that, maybe 10% of it will actually be shipped to the user itself. It's not a developer time dependency. It's actually a runtime dependency. Those are things that are going to become core to how you think the default world behaves, because you're going to be like, that's how I've always done it. I'm not going to bother changing. And that's the hard part. I don't know how to encourage good practices when at the very beginning, because it's not easy, nor is it fun sometimes.
Well, there are several things I want to talk about regarding this, and you're right. Like just because it's just because you can dead code eliminate, doesn't mean it works in your mind, right? Like I go into a file, I can't dead code eliminate in my mind. Like I just see the entire freaking file, and when I debug the thing, I can't really do that either. And so like I think that's a very people who drag in too much and then say, oh, we're just using that and tree shaking will take care of the rest. Like I think that's overly naive. That's like a very small subset of what I care about, right? I need to be able to read the code but the thing you dragged in, like it does 10 things, and like also that version, like this bug and all these kind of concern that you're not putting into your theoretical model, right? Well, one problem we have, maybe we can be a little bit more specific about this, because I don't want to sound like someone who rehash these arguments that I'm sure like people have heard lots of time. One real problem is it seems to me that lots of this is not something beginners do. This is not something that lots of senior programmers do. It's the middle of the bell curve. The people who are becoming good programmers, but not yet. They do, which is they have this extreme tendency to compress things, to prematurely compress things. If you model let's say your knowledge of your code as you write as like let's just say a stream of things, right? They will compress the first few bits, see the next few bits, compress that, and then it kind of calcifies your compression algorithm, right? Because you're not seeing the holistic picture. Like you're not supposed to prematurely compress that early on, right? Like lots of these abstraction, I would say like maybe 95% of these abstractions, they're not actually abstractions. They're just like pretty poor encoders.
Yeah.
And that is actually still okay. But the thing is, we have not learned how to decode in the industry. Like, if you have A and B and then you encode in a certain way and C comes in, and if there was no encoding at all, then you would have encoded A, B, C differently than if you just had A, B and then plus a C appended to it, right? And so what's the right thing to do when C comes in is for someone to do the pretty brutal work to go into that, decode first, right? And then re-encode, right? But nobody will do that in the typical code base, right? Because obviously in the industry, this is just way too much trouble. So the only thing you can do is just to delay that encoding as much as possible through simplicity, through like performance by default, and not trying to reach for some weird patterns and all that. Through ultimately, the only thing you can rely on is through low entropy, which is you do exactly the thing you do, right? With no decoding, with no premature encoding steps, right? So to speak, compression. By encoding, just in case we lost the track of thought here, but by encoding, I meant compression, I meant abstractions and all that, right? Excessive reuse of like 2 lines of code, for example. And so the only way we can do that right now is to just delay that so that somewhere in the future, hopefully they're smart enough to know when they need to actually start compressing things, right? Because the moment they do it, you can trust nobody else is going to go and redo it unless there's a rewrite, unless some engineer first go into that path. But that's not really aligned to anyone's performance review, so to speak. When you say, I've been decompressing someone else's abstraction, I've been inlining things. But we know it's the necessary thing to do, right? It's just nobody's going to do that on a larger scale. So what can we do about this? Well, I don't know. Like maybe we do need some kind of automatic tooling. Maybe we need some kind of language paradigm that does that for you. But maybe we need something that is, well, you know, like AI is hot. I don't want to dive into that too much right now, but like, you know, the more you look into AI for real as like an engineer, not as like a philosopher or kind of like a user, but as an engineer, you realize, well, essentially it's about compression, right? It's about search in a multi-dimensional state space and going to the lower entropy position as much as possible. Like the whole purpose of backprop is kind of that, right? And I saw a very good blog post recently where they trained a neural network to do just binary addition and see if it converges toward like a binary adder in a CPU. Turns out, no, it converges towards something that exists before, and that was designed by human actually. Through they turn the analog signal into the digital ones and do all these sorts of transformation, and then you know it clicks for you that they are able to reach that low state of entropy. And the good thing is when you retrain them, basically it's a natural decompression and recompression, right? So unfortunately, in our current industry, the only usage to control these entropy, which will be a great tool to teach newcomer, is cyclomatic complexity, which is not much. Nobody really uses it, right? Everybody knows, well, if you have too many if else's, you should do something about it. But the thing is, cyclomatic complexity doesn't understand your code. It doesn't know that it needs actually 10 ifs, right? It just says, that's too much, please break it off. And all the people I've seen who use that tool actually, they just break 5 of the if into a different function and then it calls it a day. But then now I have an extra layer of indirection and the actual complexity that I have to read again, right? So yeah, I just maybe we reach the most we can do with a human in the loop with that kind of traditional coding mechanism, and that traditional theory stem from math of composing these kind of abstraction and then scaling them up. I don't know. But Andre Karpathy has a good blog post about, a very controversial blog post about software 2.0, where one of the point is that it actually scales down and up homogeneously, and it gets to redo the entire thing. Yeah. But we do not currently in the industry have the financial incentive to hire a developer to undo the previous developer's so-called abstraction in order for the next developer to redo it. Because what is my incentive here, right?
Getting back to what you talked about, let's tie it back into the example you just showed of your gallery and like the way you used it. There are a lot of very subtle details that are very nicely done. You know, on the surface, I see a grid of images. I'm scrolling down and up. I can see the content is loading as needed. So it's not a case where my entire DOM is being polluted with a lot of elements, only on an as needed basis or things. Virtualization done really well, essentially. Then there's the other part where when I'm hovering over each image with my mouse, there's a slight magnetic drag-like effect where it's not just a simple hover, it actually tilts slightly and even shifts a bit, almost as if my hands are a little sticky, and I'm slightly moving it over as part of all these hover effects. It's very nicely done in that side as well. And of course, clicking the image takes me to the size of my viewport, and then I can see just enough of the next and previous images so I can navigate between them. So the affordance for that is really there as well. You talked earlier about, you asked people how many lines of code was written to create this, but I don't think you ever answered it. How many lines of code did it take for you to create all of these effects?
So it's a single HTML file with no compilation built for the iteration speed. Yeah, people might complain it's not in TypeScript, but look, I've done a programming language for statically type, and I dare I say the type system was pretty good, right? Thanks to the OCaml folks and all that, we forked that off from them. But but no, the iteration speed is just that much more important. Then yeah, sure, we'll add TypeScript once it becomes like a real project. Sorry, the dog is yeah.
So how many lines was it?
Yeah. So if you exclude the data, which can be arbitrarily large because it could be million lines, right? That's all in line. But excluding data, it's around 400 to 450 lines of code. No dependency at all, including the styling, and no weird tricks where I put like where I try to minify manually or something like that, right? I didn't use a prettifier. I didn't use prettier on it or whatever, but it will be 400, 450 lines of code.
No, it's very impressive, because the thing that got us started on this conversation in many ways was I believe someone shared latest UI from Netflix and how it looks and so on. And I made the off the hand comment explaining that this kind of UI on the web is very difficult. And you replied back that it is, but you can pull it off if you decide to rethink how you approach a lot of this by doing what you do. And you gave this example. And so I was very impressed, because until then, I never saw anything quite like this that was done at the size you had it. You know, people with WebGL, there's a lot of things that people have done over the years to mimic that. But I look at it in terms of like, can I understand it if I look at the source code and maybe build it myself at some point? Yours was the only one where I'm like, this is really nicely done, and it's logical, it's clever, it's not 10,000 lines of code, it's not WebAssembly, it's none of that. It's just straightforward HTML, CSS, and JavaScript modifying the DOM.
Can I just say, well, folks like you and Mr. Colin Mock, and actually there was a guy called Tony Puff with the tile-based tutorial and all that. You folks help a lot in my formatives year. I just want to say that before I dive into the explanation of it. I don't think I will have been able to make something like that. I'm quite proud of it, even though it's just 450 lines of code. First is some people who know how this works, they might have a few criticism of that. So they will say, look, this is like a mostly homogeneous kind of app, and it's not much text. It's not like a very webby. And I was like, come on, it's webby enough. Like I didn't even reach for GL, like you said, right? And to them, I would say, like, if I ever have time, I actually have a demo that a few people have seen already that is actually more text-based. And that is hopefully the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Like, you can see that also is quite a few lines of code, and it's like a full-blown web app, and it's not just like a single gallery with some local maximum or anything that people think it is. So yes, one of my goal is first use idiomatic web technology for it. Not that I think idiomatic web technology is the end goal of anything. Sorry, the dog is. Not that I think idiomatic web technology is the end goal of anything, but just because this is the most swallowable thing for people. Like, if you're doing GL, people would just say, oh, well, it's GL, right? Obviously, but they don't know what that means, right? But they'll just use that excuse, right, to say, oh, obviously, if it's GL, then all bets are off. No, I'm doing it with idiomatic web technology. There's no canvas involved. There's no GL involved. It's all like a traditional web APIs, actually. So that's one thing I care about very much. The other thing is performance has to be good. and the UX has to be good because I don't want people to dismiss it by saying, like I said earlier, like, oh, well, I don't want these animations anyway. No, you can know that these animation actually helps with establishing where you are in the gallery, right? As opposed to many other gallery, you press the arrow key a little bit too much and you're like, where am I, right? When you dismiss it, like, oh, where is the image, right? In my gallery, when you dismiss it, when you go very far, right, it dismisses back into the place you should be, which is wherever that image zoom out to. So, actually, you talk about that hover effect for the mouse. Well, design-wise, like from a UX standpoint, the thought process is, I want to indicate to people that it's clickable, right? Most people know it's clickable, but it will be nice because people move their mouse across the screen and then suddenly start moving toward them, and they're like, oh, I guess I can click on this because it's inviting me to click on it, right? And it's like a typical Flash trick too. But actually, I would say the thought process is actually the other way around, and it goes a little bit deeper than that. And this is actually, I'm very happy you asked this question. Not many people actually ask that particular thing. And I'm very happy to talk about it, which is that I actually didn't start with the UX in mind, right? You should absolutely start with the UX in mind. But my goal was actually entirely different when I was making that gallery. The hover effect is, and you've been coding for a long time, so you know what I'm talking about. The hover effect, first of all, it's not accomplishable in just pure CSS as like a discrete one-off, right? It's not like I hover and then it goes like 10 pixels above, and then when I hover out, it goes below. That can be encoded as like an animation, like a CSS, declarative CSS thing. I wanted to avoid that. Because I don't want people to reach for these kind of very strict local maximum. And the other thing is, because I have to change the image at all time, I am forcing my code not to prematurely optimize toward that particular direction I was talking about earlier, which is like, let's say, static extraction of things. I started with the code and none of the visuals, again, not recommended for real apps, but I started with just the code. And, I think about these React patterns, Vue.js, Svelte, Backbone, and like jQuery patterns and all that. And I try to find the patterns that socially, right, not technically, but socially over the last 10 to 15 years have pushed people toward bad code, toward a kind of code that is that seems good in the short term, but not really. And one of them would be like, oh, let's have this kind of nice little constrained environment, like, but it's just a button, like, and then I have this kind of CSS declaration, right? But then a designer comes on and tries to adjust a single pixel, and you have to switch the entire paradigm, right? And you're like, most of the time, this doesn't even happen. You wouldn't switch. You would just tell him off or tell her off because we can't have that effect because that's not how our SaaS pipeline was built or anything like that, right? So I don't want, like, for example, you see these kind of CSS stuff that statically extract their snippet, part of it, whatever. I don't want any of that. So I basically show the good UX. I try really hard to find a good UX that goes against all of these existing frameworks. So I think that was to echo what you said about how can we start fixing this. It's by showing these kind of UX and show it to them and say, well, do you want this or not, right? It is good. It is a mature transition. It's not like I'm trying to show off. It's not disruptive, and users definitely feel an impact of this, right? Do you want this or not? If so, you cannot use this, and that paradigm, right? You cannot even virtually diff the whole thing because, right, this is the core proposition of React. To be clear, I worked on React and I love it, right? But I think people are too religious about this, one of which is the virtual DOM diffing part, right? Where you have let's say you have a list of items like in the gallery, right? And you go over them and you render it into virtual DOM, and the virtual DOM will diff between the previous and the current and the previous snapshot and say, did it change? Did it change? Did it change? Well, yes, no, yes. Okay, well, that's 3 yeses, so we only need to surgically manipulate these 3 things. But people are not thinking in terms of latency. I came from a Flash background, graphic background, so I think in terms of latency. These things, like, what is the worst case behavior? Well, all 6 items change. And so what is the virtual DOM doing there? Nothing, right? Because ultimately it goes over 6 items. Did it change? Did it change? Did it change? Yes, 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 yes. And then you have to change the entire thing anyway, right? So basically, let's say your frame is like 15 millisecond. You barely crammed it into 15 millisecond at 60 frames per second, right? Virtual DOM made that 15 millisecond in the best case scenario into 2 millisecond, which is great, right? But then in the worst case, when things do change, it turned that 15 millisecond into 17. And now you're starting to drop frames. And so how do I fix that? Well, I have to remove the virtual DOM different. So basically, but there's no way to convey that anymore. And when I say that to people, they're like, whatever, right? So I basically, that entire gallery and the previous demo and the next demo and the demo that's coming up, which is a more traditional web app, they all reach for these kind of user experiences where developer will say, yeah, I think that's good to have as a user experience. And also they will at the same time say, I guess we really can't afford these kind of like caching strategy, like golden path driven, kind of like a throughput driven backend programming strategies, I would say, right? Because backend is much more about throughput than latency most of the time. So that started with my graphics perspective, but because for me, a frame drop is a bug. For most people now, a frame drop is just like a P4, P5, or whatever your company calls it, which is like, we're never going to fix it, right? Because it's part of the web. Obviously, you're going to drop frames, right? But no, it doesn't have to be that way, right? You get to, if you coded the worst case already, then you don't have to debug nearly as much, right? You don't have to do performance tuning. I barely opened the performance profiler for this thing, right? Most people also don't use the performance profiler, but if you want to achieve that kind of result, you definitely have to profile it a lot. I barely use the profiler because every time I'm actually just wiping that virtualized region and redrawing these cells. So I know in the worst case, that will still fit within 16 milliseconds. And on a MacBook Pro M1, M2, it would be 120 frames per second. Except Safari, which caps request animation frame at 60, but that's another story. And people will be like, well, most of the time you're not reaching for these kind of interaction. So that's why I add even more interactions like that. So when you click into the gallery, the whole 2D grid flies into a 1D one. And when they fly like that, everything's changing all the time. And when you drag your native scroll bar, because I didn't recreate a scroll bar, right? When you drag it down very quickly and you have, let's say, 10,000 images, there is no incrementalism in any of that process that you can leverage. There's no cache. All your cache are bust frame by frame all the time, right? Because the next time you drag, very likely the entire region is redrawn, right? So there's no reuse you can reach for, actually. So that these things, I don't have to think about them. I did think about them, but I don't have to code them anymore, right? Because I already catered to that worst case scenario. If everything changed, it's the same as if nothing changed for me. So that's part of why that hover is there. Because when I hover, maybe a designer will come and say, well, actually in the future, maybe the neighbor images will also kind of move toward you if it's not too disturbing, right? Then I don't have to code that specially, right? You don't have to say no to the designer because you use a CSS pipeline that's way too rigid for this extra incremental UX change that is a huge delta of code change, architectural change. So it worked like that. Basically, it's like a game engine, but like a web render loop in that sense, right? Because you blow away lots of things, and then you try to optimize against the upper bound, the worst case scenario. And what are the optimization that actually do work in this case? Well, like you said, virtualization, which is just occlusion culling for if we're speaking normally, right? I'm not sure why we call it virtualization nowadays. There's nothing virtual in that demo. And then also just making the data structure very fast and lean, right? And I don't actually, if you look at the code, I don't, when there are loops, I don't even use a break statement. That's because it's so ingrained in us that, well, if you break early, you get to save some CPU budget, right? But the thing is, in many of these cases, if you break early, you also end up with a pathological case where some other kind of effect or code kind of claim that resource. You know what I mean? That performance resource. And when you do need to iterate over all of them, let's say because it's the last image, people don't think about that, right? Because some process makes you so that you iterate through the entire array, and your user is hovering over the last one. Well, then suddenly you've exceeded your frame budget, right? So I don't break. So hovering over the first image has the exact same whatever logic that is, hit testing, zooming or whatever, than hovering over the last one. So I don't have to go scroll down all the time and test against my last image either. And people will say, oh, well, that's a different mental model. Is it hard to learn? Well, it is something to learn, but the code actually becomes simpler because I have very few if statements. Because what kills latency and what causes frame drop and inconsistencies are the if statements, right? Very fundamentally, it's when your control flow goes into that passing up instead of the other one, right? That's what causes frame drops. So when I don't have if statement, all my code becomes simpler because I have nothing to debug. It's like linear, right? I don't have to step into a debugger and say, well, is that condition true or not? The only if statement I have are the like essential ones, like is it in 1D view or 2D view, right? So all of these are actually, now we circle back to the initial topic, which is graphic and all that. But all of these are graphic programming techniques like GPU and shader programming techniques, because you don't get to say, when you have an order of magnitude more pixel, you don't get to say, well, if this pixel is that pixel is that, forget about it. You're going to be able to draw 10 pixel and like, you'll never have a game, right? When you have a million or a billion pixels, then you start thinking differently. No more if statements. Latency matters a lot. Throughput, it looks different. And so basically this is the whole gallery is actually shader programming technique in idiomatic JavaScript and HTML. That's how it. First thing I want to say is I want to thank again you and all the other people who helped me on the Q Perform and all the other forums. I still remember some of them actually. I might not remember the name too clearly anymore, but there are definitely some experts who helped me along the way, shape my thought. And I remember still this person who made that crazy 3D demo in Flash with all these polygons. He made a dinosaur and then he made like a glider and all that. And it was pushing like millions of polygons on like my shitty computer, my shitty laptop back then, which was like 20 years old. And once someone shows you that order of magnitude change, that gives you this emergent phenomenon. Because I was drawing triangles, but I was drawing 10 of them, right? But if you're drawing 10 of them, you can't think of making a dinosaur model with it, right? But he did that, and it was crazy to me. And what would the web? Our neighbor community started drawing triangles too, right? And they draw lots of them. They draw enough of them that they discovered this new GPU thing, and then that GPU thing kind of spawned an entire ML domain, which has nothing to do with drawing triangles, right? So one thing I would say is, what are we missing out on by drawing tens of rectangles? Right. Someone, when I used to be in a programming language community, there was a conversation where I was like, okay, so you play Call of Duty. You realize they're drawing like billions of triangles in real time, right? And you're telling me you cannot render 10 rectangles on your web app? Really? Like, what are we talking about here? So what if we can render a billion rectangle? What would that look like? It wouldn't even be a web app anymore. But certainly it could be something worthwhile. There are emergent phenomena in that we never got to discover because our stack has been so calcified. And one last thing I will say is, many years ago there was a Chinese Flash forum called Flash Empire, where the admin of the forum, the forum itself was using PHP or ASP, I forgot. It was just like black and white or whatever, it doesn't matter. But he made an entire forum using Flash. And I can never find that back anymore. I tried days and days, hours to try to find that back. If anybody's listening and knows what I'm talking about, Flash Empire, they made an entire form with just Flash. And I just thought it would be such a nice point to prove to people that this entire software is doable and had all the interactivity and all that. And it wasn't expensive to make. And I'll try to personally keep making these demos and show the code in public. But if someone knows how to dig around.
I'll ask around. I'll dig around as well. I do remember what you're talking about. I know exactly what you're referring to as well.
Wow.
So
okay.
because there weren't too many. It was you knew Cold Fusion was great for being able to do a lot of backend things, and the Cold Fusion and Flash integration was done really well. There are a bunch of studies on like some great examples of Flash and Cold Fusion being combined and so on. And I do remember there was a website that was entirely in Chinese that was back to all the sites are very, very similar in like what they showed, just different character set. I couldn't make sense of it, but there was no familiarity. And I do remember there was a forum that was entirely Flash because when you right clicked on it, it was all Flash, but it was had niceties to it because back then scrolling was not smooth on our browsers. It was actually like move like some pixel increments. It wasn't like today where you just like scroll, just like has like acceleration and so on. And so that site was new because it introduced a lot of these things in a very traditional, boring problem, which is displaying threaded messages. So I'll keep a lookout for that. But in the interim though, it was great chatting with you, Cheng. A lot of fun, and some the topics you mentioned here are very near and dear to things I think about a lot, and I think a lot of the audience members think about quite a bit as well. And so at some point, I think we should dive deeper into some of them in the future, and looking forward to seeing some of your new examples as well.
Yeah, I'll be happy to talk about this too. Thank you very much for the opportunity.